Hey everybody, this is Dan, and this is Dr. Dan's Corner of Knowledge, another desktop lecture for week 13 of class. So we're quickly winding down, and we skipped forward. Last week we read about David Sarnoff and RCA, and hopefully you got something out of that reading. I mean, the big idea there was that RCA was a leading company, really one of the strongest American electronics companies, if you will, from World War II up until about the 1960s, but really fell behind by not innovating. So, when we talk about the history of business, even all the way back to before 1900, when we talked about Procter and Gamble, and you read a little bit about the importance of research and development, that really comes into play throughout this whole history of American business. So there's a lesson to be learned with RCA, and the lesson is obviously if you don't innovate or obsolete yourself, you're going to quickly meet your demise. Now, what I'm holding up here is a patent drawing from the U.S. Patent Office from 1961, and you'll see the inventor is R.N. Noyce. And that probably doesn't mean anything to any of you. Maybe none of you have heard of Noyce. But this week we're going to spend some time talking about Robert Noyce, because I would argue that he's probably one of the most important inventors in the history of the country, maybe in the top 3 or 4. It's hard to sort out the importance of inventions. Certainly Edison and electricity, which we already read about, was obviously a big deal. Henry Ford, I don't know, he certainly was a good businessman, but really didn't invent the automobile, and I think that's a technology that would have come down the pike anyway. And I think the same could be said for other people we've read about, whether it's Taylor, Fred Taylor, and Taylorism, going all the way back to Eli Whitney and the cotton gin. All of these guys had great ideas and big innovations, but whether they changed society to the extent of what Robert Noyce's innovation does is something we could argue for a long time. So this week we're going to talk about Robert Noyce, the most famous person you've never heard of before, and you're going to watch a video. Now this video is an hour long, and you need to watch all of it, because there's going to be some questions not only on the discussion board but also in our final exam about Robert Noyce. We're going to spend a lot of time on Silicon Valley in our final exam, because I think it's probably the most important thing we can study right now, because it's it's got a great history to it, starting in the early 60s, and it affects us all greatly today, and I'm sure it will into the future. Now, one of the things in the video you're going to watch, it's a YouTube documentary by BBC. They're going to talk about Noyce as combining Thomas Edison and Henry Ford. So, think about that. Do you think Noyce really does embody both of those people? Is he more than that? Think about that as you move forward. And probably one of the most important things as we talk about American business, besides Noyce's innovation, which is the integrated circuit, is the way he set up his business. They talk about this West Coast business style early on in the documentary, and the way that everybody was equal at Fairchild Semiconductor, where one of his first big companies, and then also at Intel. And that meant that the president didn't have a palatial office. He had a cubicle just like everyone else. There were no reserved parking spots. All the employees were treated equal. Anyone could bring in an idea. So it sort of flattened the workplace. And I think if you look at the history of business and the people that we've read about, that's a real departure. Certainly Sarnoff, treated himself as special, as the most knowledgeable person at RCA. Henry Ford was somewhat of a tyrant, if you remember, even dictating how his employees should live. And, if you go backwards to someone like Carnegie or Jay Gould or even Thomas Edison, they were all very dictatorial, hierarchical thinkers when it came to business. So as far as what's happening in business with Noyce besides innovation is this idea of an open workplace. And for those of us in Toledo sort of sweating away at our day jobs, we don't have the kind of freedoms that we hear about with Intel and Fairchild Semiconductor, but it doesn't mean it's not possible. And I think we all know that an open workplace ultimately is more productive. So if we look at that history of business all the way back from slavery forward, you see some flattening of the hierarchy, empowering employees to innovate and empowering employees to be their best, which ultimately results in a more streamlined and more profitable business. So give that some thought. I know it's not that way really in the Midwest, but it is that way with innovative companies out in Silicon Valley and on the East Coast and also around here. It's not mutually exclusive. So that's a big legacy of Noyce besides the innovation of the semiconductor that I want you to understand. So you're going to have some questions in the discussion board, and I'm going to answer them for you. But I want you to watch the documentary anyway. So, the first one was, what role did Noyce play in changing company cultures? I think I already answered that. And then also important is, what role did the Cold War play in the development of the integrated circuit? This comes out in the documentary for a short time, and it's something to think about because, often the country's business needs have been dictated by the military. One of the things with Carnegie, when we were reading about Carnegie and steel, and I don't think we read this part, but he was very motivated to develop a new kind of steel that was made with nickel to make ships out of, because it made them more armored. In other words, it made it harder for enemy armor to puncture the steel that Carnegie made. So, there's examples of innovation. Certainly RCA, the contracts for the vacuum tube, the patents, were all had their roots in the military. So that's something that we learn with Noyce in the integrated circuit as well. And even the internet came about because of military developments. Also, the other thing, when you watch the documentary, there's a part in there about pricing, selling integrated circuits. And I want you to think about that and think about what Noyce and Ford had in common when it came to marketing and how they would market and price their products. I think it's important to understand that some of these ideas from Ford, work forward even into modern Silicon Valley. So I guess, the other big thing is, near the end of this video, they're going to talk about Robert Noyce meeting other innovators in Silicon Valley. I want you to pay close attention to that, because you're going to see an appearance of Steve Jobs in the Robert Noyce film or documentary. And next week, we're going to spend the same amount of time on Steve Jobs, because I think that that's someone we need to study as well as we look at these influential business figures in American history. So watch the Noyce video. Please watch all of it. Take time with it. There's no reading this week. I know the video's a little long. It's an hour long, so you don't have to read. But I want you to learn from it, because I think many of you don't know who he is. And when you think about all of the devices, from healthcare to computers to communications to ATMs to anything you can imagine that incorporate the integrated circuit, I think it's important that we know who came up with it, and maybe consider, why don't we know who Noyce is, but we know who Steve Jobs is? Why don't we know who Noyce is, but we know who Edison is? What's the differences in their personalities that make one well known and the other not known at all? So I hope you enjoy the documentary. I look forward to reading your discussion posts about it, and you're all doing a great job. I'll see you again next week. Take care and be safe. Thanks. Bye-bye.